Parable or a story that Jesus told his disciples regarding a certain landowner and individuals that he had hired to work his land. It's a parable, a story of Jesus that we're all familiar with, that demonstrates to us, as we used to say, it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's the way we used to define parables, and it's a pretty good definition. So we read this parable this morning with the concept or the idea of grace in mind, because this story is about grace from beginning until end. Matthew chapter 20, beginning with verse 1, Jesus says to his disciples, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers to work and to labor in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the entire day, and then he sent them into his vineyard." So he picked up these workers and he established a contract with them and said, "Here's what I will pay you. I will pay you 1 denarius. And then verse 3 says, "About 9 in the morning, he went out and he saw others standing in the marketplace, standing idly, doing nothing. And he told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.'" So he didn't nail down a price with them. He says, "I will nail down whatever is right with you when the time comes." And so they made their way into the field. He went out again about the noon hour and about 3 in the afternoon, and he did the very same thing. After about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around, and he asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. And he says to them, "You also go, work in my vineyard, in my land." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired at about 5 in the afternoon came, and they each received a denarius. Wow, what a surprise. They received a full day's pay for the short time they had worked. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive even more than the original contract price. They said, "My goodness, if those who've only worked an hour, if they got paid the contract price, we're going to get a bonus. We're going to get even better. We've worked, we've sweated, we've labored, we've toiled all day long." It says when they came in, so when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius, the original contract price. Verse 11, when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. They didn't like it. They thought this was unfair. Don't we all want justice? Seems to be one of the mantras of our day. Justice has its place. And these folks were wanting justice. They said an injustice has been committed against us. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said. And you've made them equal to us. And we've borne the burden of the work. We've toiled in the heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. I'm not being unjust toward you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? What the contract said, oral contract, what it said. Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" Then he concludes in verse 16, "So the last will be first, and the first will be last." It's an interesting story, isn't it? It's all about grace. It's all about grace. It's something that we have a great deal of difficulty dealing with. There's something about this thing of grace that we Baptists so love that really does muddy the water much more than we would care to admit about who is in the kingdom and who is not in the kingdom. This thing of grace makes things a bit more muddy than the black letter law of the Old Testament. Grace tends to confuse things. What is grace? I was reading this past week about grace, and the secular definition of grace says basically this. The word grace is said to refer to what the writer called an effortless beauty. When someone has grace, they have an effortless beauty about them. They have a charm of movement. They have a charm of form. When I read that, I thought about our dog Ginger. Because when she walks and when she runs, she has an effortless beauty about it, the way she runs and the way she carries her body. That's the essence of what the secular definition of the term grace is mean to refer to. Effortless beauty, gliding, charm of movement. But that really has little to do with the New Testament concept of grace. When we think about grace, what do we think of? The New Testament speaks of grace in this fashion. It speaks of grace as unmerited favor. That's the way we Baptists talk about it. When we say we are victims of grace, or we have experienced grace, or we are recipients of grace, we're saying that we have experienced the unmerited, the undeserved, and the unwarranted mercy, forgiveness, and kindness of God. That we haven't merited any of this grace. We haven't deserved any of this grace. Even the smallest amount of grace that comes our way is a result of God's grace toward us, not because we deserve it. So this thing of grace is truly an amazing thing. Charles Spurgeon, a preacher from days gone by, someone shared with me, wrote that man is not saved against his will, but rather man is saved by a willing operation of the Holy Spirit in his life. He says that mysteriously, here is what happens in the experience of salvation. We cannot comprehend it. We can't grasp it. We can't get our minds around it. But Spurgeon, in a very articulate way, says that a mighty grace enters the individual, a mighty grace disarms the individual, and a mighty grace act from God makes the individual a brand new creation. We love this thing of grace. We Baptists sing about this thing of grace. We hang our future on this concept of grace. We hold on to grace. We say, for by grace are you saved through faith. It is a gift of God, not of man or not of works, lest anyone should boast. Good works come about as a result of that. It's all a matter of God's grace and mercy. But amazing grace. What makes it so great, so amazing? This parable we just read is a story about grace. It shows us exactly how much grace does truly muddy the water on this thing of the kingdom. It's a story about grace. It's a story about mercy. That's the essence of what Jesus seems to want us to get today as his disciples. What is this story of grace all about? Let me share with you 4 things that I think we can take away from this parable, this story of Jesus about grace, and apply to our lives. The first of those is this: amazing grace that we love to sing about in Baptist congregations. Amazing grace. Every time, think about this, every time we have a selection day for hymns, Amazing Grace is typically one of those hymns. We love that hymn. We love to sing about amazing grace. What does this parable tell us about amazing grace? The first thing is this: amazing grace focuses upon what we have been given by God's goodness, not our own. Amazing grace focuses upon what we have been given. Now, think about this story we just read. This landowner makes his way down to a certain area in the city, and he sees individuals standing by, and he sovereignly, he freely, he of his own volition says, I'll take this worker, and I'll take that worker, and I'll select this worker to do my work in my vineyard. I need the crops gotten in from the field. I need the grapes from the vineyard harvested. And so providentially and sovereignly, of his own volition, of his own will, he says, I want you to come and work for me. I want you to come and work for me. And I want you to come and work for me. It was an act of grace that this individual exercised toward these people. You see, that's the amazing thing about amazing grace. It focuses upon what we have been given by God. Not of our own goodness, not because of our own merit, but because of God's free act. God freely bestows upon us his grace. Frederick Buechner, a theologian from days gone by, says this about this concept of grace. He says that grace is something that you can never get, but grace is something that you can only be given. Grace is not something that you can get. It's only something that you can be given. There's no way to earn it. There's no way to deserve it. Or there's no way to bring it about any more than you can deserve the taste of raspberries, cream, or earn good looks, or bring about your own birth. He says, just like you cannot bring about your own birth, it's totally in the hands of someone else. So that's the way God's grace is. You can't initiate God's grace. You can't compel God's grace. You can't demand God's grace. It's something that you cannot expect. It's something that you must freely and volitionally be given. So I was thinking about that this week in relationship to First Wallis Baptist Church. Here's a good question for us to ask ourselves. In light of the fact that amazing grace focuses upon what we have been given, what have we been given here at First Wallis Baptist Church? What have we been given? We can focus upon all the things that we've not been given. We can focus upon the multitude of things that we wish we had been given. We can focus upon the multitude of things that we wish someone would give us. But this parable says that's not to be the focus of the Christian life. The focus of the Christian life is not to be upon what we have not been given, but it is to be focused upon what we have been given. So in light of that, First Wallis Baptist Church, I ask you as your pastor this morning, what have we been given? We've been given a lot. We've been entrusted with a lot. Now you think about the inception of First Wallis Baptist Church many decades ago. Someone of their own mercy and their own goodness and their own kindness devoted this land for this church in this location, and it stands until this very day. We have this location in Wallis. We have a good location in Wallis. We've been given that, not just by the act of man, but by the act, the sovereign act, the providential act of the God that we worship and the God that we serve. That's what we've been given. What else have we been given here at First Wallis Baptist Church? We have been given this. We've been around for quite some time. God has honored that initial vision of a group of individuals who said there needs to be a congregation called First Wallis Baptist Church in this little community. God has honored that vision, and we exist today as a congregation that reflects a faithful history of God watching over providentially and taking care of us, making sure that we are still here. It has had its ups and its downs in the past. It's had its strong points, and it has had its weak points in its past. But the fact of the matter is, God continues to give us opportunities for kingdom service in this community, even in these days. What have we been given here at First Wallis Baptist Church? I'll tell you what we've been given. We have been given teachers who are more than capable of teaching the Bible and the Scripture. We have been given leaders who are more than willing and able to lead us into the future of being the kind of church that God wants us to be. We have been given much. I would challenge you at First Wallis Baptist Church this morning to think not about the multitude of things that we have not been given, but to think about those things that we have been given. I would challenge you in your individual life to stop thinking in terms of what God has not given you and start thinking about what God has given you. The gifts, the abilities, the resources, the will, the inclination, perhaps to serve children, perhaps to serve adults, perhaps to serve men, perhaps to serve women? What has God gifted you with that makes you able to contribute and value to First Walvis Baptist Church and ultimately to the kingdom that no one else can? This parable says this. When we think about amazing grace, we focus upon what we have been given, not what we have not been given. The second thing this parable tells us is this. Amazing grace avoids comparing what we have to what others have. And you think about that. This parable says to us, to you and to me and to us as a congregation, that if we really take this grace seriously, this amazing grace seriously, we avoid comparing what we have to what others have. Now, let me bring your attention to the parable once again. When did the problem in the parable begin to emerge? The problem in the parable began to emerge when the workers began comparing themselves one with the other at the end of the day. You notice that? That's a very interesting twist on this narrative. It's a very interesting twist on this story. Everything was hunky-dory, so to speak, as long as they were working, as long as they were laboring. Everything was hunky-dory as long as they were counting on getting paid a certain amount. But then at the end of the day, when the results came in, and they began comparing what they had with what someone else had, comparing what they had received with what someone else had received, then all kinds of problems and all kinds of hellishness resulted. You see, that's the problem when we began looking at amazing grace in terms of comparing ourselves to what others have. Here's the way I would say it. When these individuals at the end of the day began their comparing of themselves to other workers, that's when the scorekeeping kicked into action. Scorekeeping has no place with regard to amazing grace. Scorekeeping has no place with regard to amazing grace. One individual I read this week said this: scorekeeping seldom works in our favor. Seldom works in our favor, especially with regard to this issue of grace. Scorekeeping seldom ever makes the Christian look good. Scorekeeping. I share with you this morning that as I look back on my ministry of these 40, 45 years, one of the more challenging experiences I went through in my days as a young pastor was the time when one particular lady in the congregation, her name was omitted from the worship folder, and her congregational rival was included. Oh my goodness. You mentioned her name, but you left my name out of the list. How dare you do that? You always give attention to her. She always gets recognition. You always leave me out. I never get my due. That's a modern day example of scorekeeping. This text says this: when we begin to compare ourselves to others in the kingdom, when we engage in this mentality of scorekeeping, I want my due. In fact, I want more than my due. That leads to all kinds of problems. Why? Because amazing grace is not about scorekeeping. It's not about comparison. It's not about comparison. Now, we have to watch that here at First Walvis Baptist Church, and I'll tell you why. We have a little scorekeeping with regard to individuals. We don't have much of that kind of shenanigan going on here. But I, as pastor, and you as parishioner, know this: we can engage in a different kind of scorekeeping. We can keep score with regard to congregations that are larger than us. We can say, well, look over there at the First Baptist Church of whateversville. Look at that building that they have. Oh, if we had that kind of building, the amazing things we could do. Oh, look at their budget. Oh, if we had all of the money in their budget, imagine all the things that we can. Look at that children's playground. If we had a playground like that, can you imagine all the things that we would. Look at that youth program. My goodness, they take their youth to Greece. They take their youth to Italy. They take their youth to England. They take their youth to all kinds. If we had a youth program, what the sky's the limit on the things that when we engage in that kind of mentality, congregation, we are engaging in our own version of scorekeeping. God is not going to judge us by how well we competed with a mega church. He's not going to hold us accountable for how we competed with a large congregation. He's going to hold us accountable for one thing and one thing alone. What have you done as a congregation or as individuals with what I have given you by my amazing grace? Amazing grace is not about comparisons. Amazing grace is about faithfulness. Number 3, this story tells us that amazing grace always remembers how far we've come. Now you think about that. I was reading this just in a casual way at the beginning of last week, and I realized that this story tells me that amazing grace always remembers how far we have come. This group of individuals forgot where they had come from. They forgot this, that at one point in time, early on in the day, in fact, as the sun was rising, they forgot that they were standing on a street corner begging for something to do so that they could make a little bit of money, so that they could put a little bit of food on the table, so that they could have a decent night's rest, so that they could get up and do the very same thing tomorrow. They had forgotten the fact that they would have given anything at the beginning of the day for the little amount of pay that they were about to receive. You see, the problem with these individuals was this. They had forgotten at the end of the day how far they had come. Now I think about that in my own life. Amazing grace wants me to remember how far I have come. Amazing grace wants you to remember how far you have come. Not necessarily how far you have not gone, but how far you have come. I'll say to you this morning, had it not have been for God's grace acting in my life as a 17-year-old many decades ago in my little obscure hometown of Ladonia, Texas, had it not have been for that moment in my life, I probably never ever would have gained a firm footing to manage life itself. And there's no telling where I would be. And it's probably also true of you. That if God's grace had not operated in your life, you would never be where you are today. In fact, it might be this. You might not even want to think about where you would be but for the grace of God working in your life. Amazing grace always remembers how far we have come. Let me ask you this, congregation. First of all, this Baptist church. Do we remember how far we've come? You think about that. Some of you that have been members of this church for a long, long time. Some of you that can talk about the ups and the downs, the challenging moments, the moments of uncertainty, the moments of difficulty, the moments of crisis, the moments of chaos. Then look at where we are today by the grace of God. Stability, security, maturity, giving us a firm footing for faithfulness as we face the future in Wallace, Texas. Congregation, let us not forget how far we have come. That's what Amazing Grace is all about. And finally, Amazing Grace enables us to give because we've been given to. Amazing Grace enables us to give because we've been given to. It was no doubt the intent of this landowner that just as he was merciful toward his workers be merciful toward other workers. You see, we're not the end all, this parable says. The kingdom doesn't stop with us. Rather, the kingdom works through us. We have been given grace so that we might extend that same grace to others. That's the peculiarity about Amazing Grace. It enables us to give because we've been given to. One individual writes this: grace is more like unto a fire hose than an eyedropper, because it floods other people who stand in need of it. Now you think about that image. You think about that image. God's grace is more like a fire hose than it is an eyedropper. We want to reduce the grace to an eyedropper and say, oh, I'll sprinkle a little bit here, or I'll extend toward that individual or that group of individuals, or we'll extend it to people like us. But biblical grace will not be confined to an eyedropper. Biblical grace is a fire hose that wants to flood the lives of other individuals. Another individual wrote this about this thing of grace in local churches today. I know it has no application to us, but it says, too much of church doings in this day and time is rooted more in the love of law than it is in the law of love. Now you think about that. Too much of church activity today is rooted more in the love of law and rules than it is in the law of love. Let's get intensely practical on that point. Can I meddle just a little bit more? You think about this. In how many of our Baptist congregations, our membership policies are based more upon exclusiveness than they are inclusiveness? You think about that. We put together our policies. We put together our guidelines. And as bad as I hate to say it, so many times those policies and those guidelines, even though they are well-intended, are more entrenched in exclusiveness, excluding, ostracizing, than including. Exclusion is based upon the law, the love of law. Inclusion is based upon the law of love. We sing, just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me. But then our policies frequently are based upon quite to the contrary. Amazing grace focuses upon extending the same grace that I've experienced to someone else. Their baggage may not be the same baggage as mine. In fact, in my assessment, my judgment, their baggage might be more scandalous than mine. But amazing grace extends mercy. I was thinking about that this week. One of the most frustrating things around our household during the school year is mathematics. Oh, God. I hate math. Don't you hate math? If you're a Christian, you hate math. Sorry, Eddie. I hate math. There's this thing called the old math. I was reading about it this past. You have been exposed to this thing of old math, right? You remember how old math used to work? Old math works from the right to the left. That's the way we were trained, right? Old math works from the right to the left. But oh, we did away with that. Now we've got the new math. New math works from the left to the right. And so when I sit down with Rhett and try to help him with this new math, I'm wanting to do this right to left thing. But Rhett's math is left to right math. It's a different world. It's a different set of rules. It's a different law. Folks, I'm here to tell you that's the way this thing of grace works. We want to do this thing of the kingdom from right to left. We just want to do it that way. It's our preference. But grace works contrary on most occasions to what our preferences are. So this parable is about amazing grace. It's not about mundane grace. It's not about pedantic grace. It's not about easy grace. It's about a grace, a kingdom grace, that's probably going to require that we allow ourselves to be stretched just a little bit.
contorted just a little bit. So that even some latecomers to the vineyard can be included in it.